So now we come to the bookend of our conference, a wonderful bookend to indeed. We had the pleasure of having with us Dr. Wendy Silverman, who is the Alfred Messer Professor of Child Psychiatry and Director of the Yale Child Study Center Program for Anxiety Disorders. Before going to Yale University, she developed and directed the Child Anxiety and Phobia Program, housed within the Department of Psychology at FIU. Wendy has developed and evaluated evidence-based assessment and treatment procedures for use with children who have anxiety disorders for many years. She has received numerous research grants, including a mid-career development award from the National Institute of Mental Health. She has published extensively in the area of childhood anxiety disorders, including 5 books. She's currently co-editor of Clinical Psychology Review and past editor of the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, associate editor of the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, president of the Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, and past chair of the NIMH Grant Review Panel. Wendy, it's a pleasure to have you with us again. Thank you for the years of support and service to the Melissa Institute and for your work.
Okay, well, thank you, Etione, for the introduction. But I do want to say that, and I want to begin with some heartfelt comments, if I may. First of all, though, I do want to give a round of applause to the audience, because like all of you, I began also at 8:30, and it's a long day. And I think it's great that we've managed to keep it going. And I think it speaks to the fabulous quality of today's presentations, and also to the wonderful audience being so interested in these important topics. I also want to begin, Dawn. I didn't know until I heard you presenting, and I just do want to express my, publicly, I just want to express my deep sympathy. And I'm also really glad you reminded us of a great opportunity to donate in Marion's memory with the Melissa Institute. And I really, certainly know I'm planning to do that as soon as I can later today. I also want to thank, 17 years ago, we heard a sad story today from Dawn, and 17 years ago, I first met Lynn and Michael. And I think Lynn and Michael, we all agree that it was kind of like love at first sight. And I heard the story about Melissa, and, and we just became friends. And we also, though, have shared some really good news about our marriages of our children. I know it's hard to believe, but also our grandchildren that we now have. And in fact, Lynn and Michael gave grand rounds a number of years ago to the Yale Child Study Center, which is actually a big deal. And they did, and people still, I'm not exaggerating, it comes up in some conversations, and maybe that's something, Etione, we should talk further about, about some collaboration. So I just want to say thank you to you, and it's been a real honor and a really important part of my professional and personal life to be a part of the Melissa Institute. Okay, do I still have time to do my presentation now? Okay, I hope so. But I want to say that, and it's a pleasure because it's been 2005 since I presented. So thank you for inviting me back. I hope the fact that it's been 17 years doesn't mean okay, we'll try her again. It's maybe she'll do better this time. No, okay. But so thank you very much for this. And you can see that, and I know that was, so I make some bad jokes sometimes. I try to compete with Dawn, who's worse, who gets better jokes, who gets worse jokes. So we can keep score, Dawn. So so this is the title of my presentation, and I have royalties from Oxford University Press to disclose. So, and I'm kind of like the outlier today, because I'm going to be speaking more about the internalizing problems and about anxiety. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, because of this audience, these are the DSM-5 anxiety disorders. I think the names are kind of self-explanatory, so I'm not going to review them. One thing that I did actually put them up on on purpose developmentally. So just like an FYI, like phobias and selective mutism usually do come up early in childhood, and separation come up early in childhood. Social anxiety is more like more into the later elementary, middle school years, and then middle to adolescence, we see more the GAD, the panic, and the agoraphobia. And these are the most, if not the most prevalent disorders that in the population, whether you're talking about children, adolescents, adults, they cause extreme impairment with family and friends and school and somatic complaints. And so, and they cause a huge burden to families, psychologically, emotionally, and also a huge burden in terms of the strain on the mental health and medical system. So and it's a big problem. And this is just like, again, a very quick overview that when we speak about anxiety, we speak about the body, we speak about breathing quickly, getting, feeling dizzy, butterflies in my tummy. We think about thoughts and that we may have that my parents are going to die, I'm going to fail school. And a big part of it is behavior, which is the avoidance, staying away from things that make us nervous. So this is like just a basic conceptualization of how anxiety, across all those disorders, how they manifest themselves. So what I'm going to do today is I want to give you a lay of the literature land. I made that up, lay of the land. I'm going to give you the lay of the literature land more in terms of, I kind of wanted to begin a bit with COVID because of the impact it's had. So I want to give you a lay of the literature that we have. And I do want to give a shout out to you, Michael, because I really do appreciate all the literature you share with us, some of us on your listserv about the pandemic. I really do read them, and I forward many of them to my family. I'm not going to present that literature, talk about that literature. I'm going to talk more about the mental health literature. And then I'll talk about the impact on children, young people, and parents, and who's most impacted. And then the rest of my presentation will be about science-based treatment, and more specifically talk about the research that I've been doing. And I was so glad when Leanne mentioned this is not something that happens overnight. This is decades and decades and decades of my work. Yes, and it is decades and decades and decades. It's actually 4 decades, to be honest, of my work in this area, but also not just me, like, so many people in the fields. So I will try to give you where I think we are now on this topic of science-based treatments of CBT in parents. So that's what I hope to do today. Again, Michael, you shared this. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The top line, you shared this with me about 3 weeks ago. Children as young as 8 should be screened for anxiety, experts recommend. And there's a draft guidance now under review because of course the incredible toll that the pandemic has had on young people, and specifically anxiety. So now this is probably going to happen, that there will be a screen, even not even for kids who present with anxiety. Any child at all, young as 8, should be screened with or without symptoms. And then I have some other headlines that you can see about how COVID has probably harmed kids' mental health, and mental health is in crisis. So those are the headlines. And when you look at some of the studies that have been done, this is, you can see for yourself. What's not on here, which I think is really needs to be on here, is how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of children have lost parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, due to COVID, and just the grief reaction, the traumatic stress reaction that has led to. And beyond that, the things that we all hear about, the direct viral threat, the schoolwork pressures, the managing the boredom, not seeing friends, being isolated, the economic impacts, and we've heard about the increase in domestic violence. So that's sort of like what we hear, and we see a lot of it in the media. What I think is really interesting is, there's the media, and then there's also the science. And this is, I think, a really interesting editorial that just came out a month ago in one of the top child psychology and psychiatry journals. And what these researchers did is they actually looked at all the literature, all the mental health scientific COVID-related literature ever since COVID appeared. And I knew there was such a thing as a Google map, but I actually never saw a literature map. So what you see on the left of that screen is the literature map. And you could see the different colors show like what are the main topics and who's been citing who. It's hard to get, that map is from the editorial, but let me just call your attention to the trends. Well, first of all, before I call your attention to the trends, what's really amazing is how there have been over 3,602 papers, scientific papers, which I think is really a lot considering we're talking about 2020. But what's more interesting though is although we have this many papers, only 23% actually report new data, original new data. The rest are opinions, reviews, perspectives, editorial. So that's an important point. So although we may think we have a lot of science, 23% out of 3,000, I mean, again, it's pretty good, but you know, it is what it is. And in terms of what these papers have looked at, 4 trends. One is the mental health consequences. So what have been the consequences on mental health professionals, preschoolers, university students? Also, what have been the consequences on physical activity, suicide risk, and prenatal and perinatal factors? Okay, that's one trend. Second trend is what has been the impact on pre-existing disorders? And I actually found this super interesting as someone talking about anxiety and doing anxiety research and treating children with anxiety disorders for all these years. The literature was not large enough to talk about the impact on anxiety. Instead, most of the literature has been on autism, substance use, and eating disorders. Third trend is family outcomes, family violence, and parent mental health. And last is somatic consequences, how it's been affecting, especially the inflammatory syndrome, which is related to stress reactions. So that's one thing about the science. The other thing about the science on COVID's mental health is if you look at what the sources of the new data, so that's like 23%, what that new data looks like is one, data from segments of the population, and these have been international studies, including China specifically, including Canada and the United States, and including Europe, and particularly England, I think has been really at the forefront in some of this new data. That's a second source of the data is the comparison with some people have pre-pandemic data, so how, you know, kids before, and how do they look after? And not as much, but you know, there are a few studies looking at how the mental health has been changing during the course of the pandemic. So some of the things I'll talk about are using some of the sources of the new data, and there's also interviews and qualitative data. So, so is it true, those media reports? Yes. The media is correct that the mental health of COVID, you know, there has been an increase, and the United Kingdom is much better than America, from what I can see, in tracking children and young people's mental health, and that they're actually doing that on a regular basis. So in 2017, before COVID, close to 11%, 1 in 9 children and young people had a probable mental disorder. During COVID, July 2020, it went up to 16%. And then in the same survey, in United Kingdom survey, you can see here that there was not much difference between the boys and the girls. But again, you see that increase of about 11% to 16% in just 3 years. I mean, I think 3 years, I mean, I think that's, you know, really is sad. Percentage of children by age, what we also see again in the survey is the increase and a larger increase for children as they get more into adolescence. Now, in terms of anxiety, because that was just mental health, in terms of anxiety, I wanted to speak about COVID and why COVID is so unique, but also why it's so relevant and why we really do need to do, and we are doing more research. In fact, you know, even I'm doing this at Yale and others, but you know, what's unique about COVID that makes it specifically relevant to anxiety? So what's COVID? We know what it is. It's threat. And think about it in the very beginning, before we had before we had vaccinations, before we had treatments, all we saw were people maybe dying. So, and we knew very, very little about it. So there was a threat to it. It's also so uncertain because it was new, and we didn't experience anything like that. We weren't alive 100 years ago during the Spanish flu epidemic. So the uncertainty of all this and how these threats were going to affect us was really unclear. And when things are uncertain and things are threatening, and it was also so uncontrollable. We didn't know what we could do because, again, it was before vaccinations, before treatments, and all we were seeing in the media were like people, on ventilators. What's anxiety? These are the key features of anxiety. When we're all like this, but if you ever work with very clinically anxious people, this is what they do. They overestimate threat. So although COVID was a threat to all of us, if you're prone to anxiety, you really thought your parents were going to get it. You really thought they might die. If you really cannot, and when something is uncertain, when you're anxious, being unable to tolerate uncertainty is even more difficult, even more challenging. I can't handle it. I can't take the uncertainty. I can't sleep at night. I'm just losing it because I can't handle all this, and I can't control this. This is like, look what's happening. I can't control it. So you could see how it's a perfect storm, COVID and anxiety. And in fact, I just showed you this. You cannot read this, I can tell you that, but it is color coded. This was, but what I wanted to show you is I talked about just now. It increased that. This is a study, and they looked at in Canada, and they did show some kids did do occasionally better, and that's why it's color coded blue. You don't pay attention to the numbers; you won't get them because they're too small. So some kids did occasionally get better, but most were worse. And the takeaway for me from this is that most kids, regardless of age, did get worse, although that other, but I think what's tricky about this is it varies by type of problem. And so deterioration and depression was highest for the 10 to 12-year-olds, and deterioration in anxiety and irritability was highest for the 6 to 9-year-olds. My only point of this is not to really remember the specific detail, but just to say, yes, some kids get better, some kids got worse. There may or may not be age differences, but it varies by the disorder because different disorders, manifest themselves at different time periods, at different ages. The other thing about anxiety that we all know about that's very, very common, and I've done a lot of work on as well, is that a lot of kids who are anxious have chronic school absenteeism. Whether you call it school refusal, chronic school absenteeism, in the old days, it was called school phobia. We don't call it that anymore. This is a very, very common problem before COVID. 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, more pandemic fallout, the chronically absent student. And this happened to be in a middle school not too far from Yale in Hartford, Connecticut. And I find that, the heading, that was the headline and the subheadline. I don't know what you call the subheadline, the caption under the headline. This was what it was. At one middle school, more than 40% of the students have been chronically absent. I mean, can you imagine, you guys out there, and I know many of you in the schools, more than 40%? And people now are doing gift cards and night classes, and they're having lotteries, and they're having pep rallies to get our children back to school. And, this was a problem before COVID, and we're only going to see this getting way worse, clearly, because for all the different factors, whether they psychological and political, etc. So thus far, I basically have said that there's a lot of literature, and I really, can't give you that many because, but I wanted to just give you a paint to you that although there's a lot of literature, keep in mind when it comes to the science, there's only about 23 of new data, okay? I think it's really important when we, think about what we hear in the media. The other thing is that COVID and anxiety are perfect storms. And it's not surprising that we see an increase in some ages in anxiety. And we also see, though, that the mental health problems increase, including anxiety, depression, irritability, but it's really important to always keep a developmental frame whenever we think about anything impacting children. And children with chronic school absenteeism increase with COVID-19. So again, a lot of this you heard, but I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of the summary of what the science is showing on this. And continuing with what the science is showing on this, is looking at, and by the way, when I put studies up in presentations, I actually really do look at the studies because I try to put, just to make sure that I'm presenting data that I think is worth noting. And this was actually a very good study. It's based on a very large sample. I won't get into it, but there's something called the ABCD study. It's a very, very large brain study that's funded by NIDA. And so they leveraged COVID. They leveraged their grant, and they were able to look at the top 20 predictors of young adolescent anxiety during the pandemic. And I just highlighted the top 4, which is female, if you're a girl, pre-existing internalizing problems was the top predictor, how the parents felt or handled the virus, and the time spent browsing the internet. Those were the top. And there are others. I think that's really interesting, really important. And why I especially think it's interesting is those of you who may remember my presentation back in 2005 at the Melissa Institute, I actually gave a presentation on the effects of Hurricane Andrew. And this was research in collaboration with my friend Annette LaGreca at University of Miami. And these were the predictors when we looked at Hurricane Andrew. These were the predictors as well of the disasters. Also, exposure is another key predictor of the natural disasters. They didn't look, from what I could tell, they didn't look at exposure, but certainly if you were exposed more directly to the pandemic, whether it be someone ill in the family, I'm certain that also is up there. I just didn't see it being examined. But otherwise, all of those other variables, being female, pre-existing internalizing, Annette and I had data before Hurricane Andrew, and we looked and we found the kids who were anxious before Hurricane Andrew did way worse, but they had more persistent symptoms after Hurricane Andrew. And similarly, how the parents felt. And back in 92, 93, the kids were not browsing the internet, but there was a lot of social media, a lot of television, as there still is, and media coverage and watching TV is certainly also a predictor, whether it be way back when watching the news, the television news, or now scrolling your devices as being top predictors. Now, this is, whenever I see, sometimes I see things and I go, wow, that's really interesting. And so these were some headlines that also came up during COVID. This was the first one on the left, August 10th, 2020. And this is in the opinion of the New York Times. What if some kids are better off at home? And for parents like me, the pandemic has come with a revelation. For our children, school was torture. Or this was how the pandemic actually improved my mental health. And then you could see, the other headlines. Feeling less anxiety since the coronavirus lockdown? You're not alone. So I was like, that's really interesting. Really? That's interesting. But then I thought about it, and we see all these kids with anxiety. And I thought about it, and I said, you know what? Yeah, I kind of see this with some kids with anxiety. And then what happened was I actually I have some collaborative relationships with some people at NIMH. One of them is Danny Pine, who is an author on this paper, and he actually shared this paper with me. Not related to this, he just shared it with me because it's such an interesting paper. And the name of the article is Which Anxious Adolescents Were Most Affected by the COVID-19 Pandemic. And again, this, I put the slides, the figure, the data, but I want to just now give you the headlines, but I wanted you to see that they had kids who had generalized anxiety, primarily kids who had social anxiety. They had child ratings, they had parent ratings, they had clinician ratings, and they measured anxiety, perceived stress, and COVID-related worries by all these informants. And what they found was, on average, anxiety and perceived stress peaked. And we all know this is how we felt. It peaked during the initial months, right? Remember I said we all felt it. We were all nervous. We were all anxious. And if you were prone to anxiety, you felt it even more because of the uncertainty and because of the lack of control. But then as it went on, we felt a decline. We sort of got a bit desensitized to it, et cetera. But the adolescents with pre-pandemic generalized anxiety, they always had higher levels. That's what the figures are showing, but I'm telling you what the figures are showing. The adolescents higher in pre-pandemic generalized anxiety had higher levels of initial anxiety, perceived stress, and COVID-related worry compared with the adolescents lower in generalized anxiety. Okay, and that's what you expect. The more anxious you are in the beginning, the more anxious you're going to be. What's so interesting, and it supports those headlines, is that the adolescents higher in pre-pandemic social anxiety actually had lower levels, okay, of initial anxiety, perceived stress. And it's, again, I love it when science and media news, because, it's not always fake news. Sometimes there's real news. And sometimes when you have science that backs up the news, it's really like encouraging. And especially when it supports your own clinical observations. And so I think it's important to know that, first of all, not just that how the pandemic affected us depends on age and depends on disorders, but even when it comes to the anxiety is heterogeneous and it doesn't necessarily affect all of us. And when you think about this, it also means that, I hope there isn't another pandemic, but it does suggest that we need to understand that some people are going to react more poorly to it, especially those with higher anxiety. But with some of those kids with social anxiety, they're going to be okay. But then when you have to open up, with those kids with social anxiety, it's not going to be so easy. So we have to pay attention to these kinds of nuances. The other thing I mentioned that there's been some studies looking over the months, month by month and month. And this is a project that we're actually collaborating with, but these are not my data, but we've been collecting the same data at Yale. And this is looking at parent ratings on a very popular scale used in Europe called the Strength and Difficulty Questionnaire. And it's got 3 subscales: behavioral, emotional, and attentional. It's color-coded because, again, you hear about it, but when the data show it so beautifully and, frankly, very, very, very sad. The green are the parents of children with special education needs, and the pink reddish colors are the low-income families. And if you look at that, you really see, when it came to all the subscales, the parents of the kids with special education, the parents of low income, they, rated their children as significantly worse. And sure, it kind of like goes, plateaus over time, but they're still significantly higher. And again, it highlights how COVID really, made a bad situation worse for many, many people. And last, relating to COVID, and then I'm going to move more into the work on anxiety, and I want to, but this is where, I kind of said, I think some, sad things. And in fact, the mental health service needs, and this is as from the American Psychological Association, only a few months ago. And look at this, from March 2020 to October 2020 versus 2019, the mental health related emergency department visits increased 24%. and 31%. Okay, so the kids presenting to emergency rooms, look at that increase in just a year. But then look at this, only 4,000 out of more than 100,000 US clinical psychologists are trained in child and adolescent clinicians. 4,000 out of 100,000. I mean, I'm like so depressed by this because, I've been in this field for so long and I didn't realize, and the American Psychological Association, and they've got the data about who's specializing in clinical child and who's not. So I just find this, I know it's not a typo, it's not 40,000. And maybe it is a typo, but no. Oh no, only 4,000 out of 100,000. Okay, but it's still a very low percentage. I misspoke when I read that slide, but you still get the point, 4,000 out of 100,000, okay? And then if you look in the school psychology field, even though they recommend a certain percentage there, in terms of how many they expect per 500 students, the current estimate that we now have only one school psychologist per 1,020, close to 1,200. And then students from lower SES have a lower rates of counselors and school psychologists in their districts. So, I mean, I guess, my first part of my presentation, I know is a little bit sad, but, I think the nuances are interesting and the needs are really important. But I do want to now be a bit more positive about at least some of the, I think, really important work that's being done that is evidence-based to help children with anxiety and what is, I think, the strongest as of now science-based recommendations for helping children with anxiety, especially given what I just shared with you about the need that's out there. And it's only going to get, and the likelihood of it exacerbating with COVID. So we all know, I think many of you know, that cognitive behavior therapy is the strongest evidence-based treatment. So it's got an education phase where we talk about, you could see that for yourself, and it's got, and I actually do want to say I was really, I loved the SNAP. I loved the SNAP acronym, but I do, and there's no but, I love the SNAP acronym, and it actually reminds me of our acronym that we've been using for, over 30 years now, actually, which is STOP, which is scared. We have a stop sign. We have stop signs all over our clinic. And it says STOP stands for scared, thoughts. Like, are you scared? How do you know you're scared? And you do the tripartite view. What are your thoughts? I think, my mom is going to die if she gets COVID. I think I'm going to fail school because I'm failing school because of COVID. What are your other thoughts, or what other things you can do? And that's where we, do a lot of the, the coping kind of work that Leanne talked about. And that, of course, Don, really, really pioneered, in his, classic book, Cognitive Behavior Modification, where he talked about stress inoculation for children. I mean, so Don was still doing, this really, important work. And so that's our acronym for dealing with the self-control and the cognitive work. But also, I'm also as much of a, I actually view myself more of a BCT person than CBT. So I really emphasize behavioral exposures or behavioral experiments. So we do exposures, face your fear in the session, out of session. And then we do practice relapse prevention. And so that, and then we do adjunctive strategies, including, I love that we heard about mindfulness, because mindfulness can be a really helpful adjunctive strategy, and as well as these other types of strategies. So that's CBT. And as I said, it is the strongest science-based approach. I mean, it clearly is. There isn't any, this is assuming, and as Dan said, I love the presentations today. I love that I can bounce off so many of them. I love what Dan said, is that CBT is only as good as someone who can deliver it well. So we have to hope that we have well-trained clinicians doing it correctly and with integrity. But assuming that we do, which is, not always something that we can assume, but assuming that we do, the outcomes are good. But not everybody gets better. So, it depends if the glass is half full or half empty. But from the glass half empty perspective, about 25 to 40% of kids do not improve. Okay, about 25 to 40. So, And so if you're getting it well delivered, and if the families are practicing it and they're doing their exposures, and as Don said, the therapeutic alliance, and you're like, you tailoring things to fit the needs of the family and not just following some cookbook. If you're doing it with strong clinical sensitivity and integrity, it can work for many children. That's the glass half full. The half empty, though, is that, as I said, not all of them get better. And what are the predictors? The predictors have been all over the place, frankly. But if I had, so this is, there are many papers, including some of that we've done, and they're kind of like all over, but I will give you what does seem to be a pretty consistent predictor, which is, not surprisingly, the more severe, the more impaired, you're not going to do as well. It's almost like a duh, right? I mean, the worse you are, for many treatments are not going to help you. And this is especially true for adolescents with social anxiety. And I think it's because, in my own opinion, is social anxiety really requires a lot more behavioral exposures and a lot more kind of social skills kind of work. So, and I think just this, but anyway, but that's another topic. But anyway, but severe anxiety, and especially adolescent social anxiety, they're the predictors. So I have been doing this for a while, and I was doing it, I was at SUNY Albany. I actually began my career at SUNY Albany with, some of you may know David Barlow, who is an expert adult anxiety researcher. And then I moved to FIU, and for 22 years, I was doing, work at FIU at the anxiety program that I at the time set up and developed, and still going quite strong, in fact. And what I've been doing after I did some initial clinical trials just to see if CPT can work, that's like in the early days, frankly, and when I mean the early days, I mean like in the early 90s, where, we showed some efficacy studies. But then after that, I was much more interested, because it was like, okay, CPT works, but like, why does it work? For whom does it work? And most importantly, how can we make it better? Leanne, I'm quoting all of you, good is not good enough. How can we make it better? And I guess, and the way I've been really focusing on this, and I've been focusing on it in several ways, but one of the ways I've been focusing it on is with adding parents. Now, I know everybody out there says, oh yeah, of course, the parents, we must have the parents. Well, guess what? There have been about 40 clinical trials comparing individual child behavior therapy compared with individual child cognitive behavior therapy involving parents. There has been very little evidence that adding parents enhances individual treatment. And again, this is many studies. This has been meta-analyses. There was even a meta-analysis when you take all these studies and you look at all the, all the results of all the studies. Even a 2020 meta-analysis came to the same conclusion. Now you might say, huh? Now I don't like to hear this, because I'm a parent, and I know it's hard for and it's hard for me to believe I'm actually now a grandparent. I know it's probably not hard for you to believe that I'm a grandparent, but it's hard for me to believe that I am now. And so it's hard for me to believe, as a parent and a grandparent now, how can this be? Well, it's not because parents are not important. No, it's because of the difficulty in working with children and parents, difficulty in dealing with a very, very complicated dynamic of an anxious child with a parent who often is anxious, him or herself. And the problem also is these 40 studies, it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like going to some like huge wedding or whatever with all this food, and you don't know, like, oh, should I take the meatballs, or should I take the egg rolls, or should I take the sushi, or the studies have looked at so many different targets, so many different variables, and they often smush them I make that word up, but I don't know what other word to use, but smush. They smush all these different behavior things. You've got like 14 sessions. They're trying to work with the kid. And at the same time, they're saying, okay, parent, and like, now we're going to teach you to do these things. And then on top of that, they don't usually measure the parent variables. And so it's kind of like, if you try to do the kitchen, and I think Don also said this earlier this morning about like, what's the, like there's a lot of stuff, and like, you got to really need to try to figure out what's the, the word is mechanism. What is the mechanism? Statistically, it's what's the mediator. And I've been doing, and this is what we've been focusing on. And I put in green what I think, because we've now done 3 trials and there's consistency here. And I'm feeling more and more confident that these are important mechanisms in terms of if you target these, you will likely enhance individual CBT. Then that's reducing parent site control, reducing negative reinforcement. What does that mean? Okay, well, let me tell you what it means in more simple English. Well, in simple English, clinically, we now call it the protection trap with the parents. And we also look at in terms of reducing site control, we call it reducing the emotional discipline trap. And again, now it's like, well, what does that mean? Okay, I'll tell you what it means. It's like, I think it's a Spice Girl song. I'll tell you what I'll tell you what I mean, or what I really, really mean. Okay, this is what I really, really mean. Okay, and a cartoon, here's the site control. They act like they own me. Okay, that's the site control. That's how the child feels. And here's the little girl. This is great. She's in the bed. But then you see she's in bed with her parents and she says, I'll have to wake up crying in the middle of the night more often. Because look what happened. She cried. She got into her parents' bed. Okay, so the first is the emotional discipline trap or the site control. The bottom is the negative reinforcement or the protection trap. Okay, and to be even a little bit, I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into this for a moment because I think it's really important for those of you who are clinicians. So actually in 1996, I wrote this book, and I do now need to be a little sad again, but I do want to, I don't know if Dan is still on here because I know Dan knew Bill Katinas. Bill Katinas was my closest friend and my closest collaborator when I was at FIU. And if you look at my publications, they're all with Bill. And he was a dear friend and a brilliant person. And unfortunately, he was COVID collateral, as we say, and that he did pass away, during the COVID, and it was related to COVID. And so I want to give a big tribute to Bill, because I feel so much of my thinking is related to my collaboration with Bill. So anyway, in this book with Bill, we talked about the protection trap, and it was exactly what I just showed you with that little girl in the cartoon. So, okay, your little girl, her name is Rachel, and she's scared, and she's nervous, and she's crying. She goes, Mommy, Mommy, Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared. I don't want to sleep alone. I don't want to do this. The parents say, oh, Rachel, parents love their daughter. They don't want to see their child distressed. They don't want to see that. So they bring the child in the bed. And it's important because what's happening is Rachel has that short-term belief, like as the girl said, this is great. But you know what? The parents feel like they have protected their child. It is our instinct as parents to protect our child. This is not bad parenting. This is actually just loving parenting. But when you keep doing this, you can see it gets to be, the learning term is negative reinforcement, because then it brings about relief. The child continues this avoidance and distress, and it becomes a trap, and it becomes a vicious cycle. That's the protection trap. And so when we try to decrease this in treatment, we would be very explicit. We would lay out what would be the kinds of things as a parent you should not you need to try to do to reduce this protection trap. And so here's a list. The first one is the sleeping alone and, what the parent can do. Let's just skip to the last one. You could read the two others on your own. Child asks to miss school on the day of the class presentation. And you say, no, you're going to school. Remember that chronic school absenteeism? Well, that chronic school absenteeism, usually oftentimes it's because the parent says, oh, okay, forget it. You don't, stay home. It must be hard for you. In fact, why don't we go to my office today and we can stop at Dunkin' Donuts on the way? And I'm not making up these examples. These are real examples. So it's really important to try to decrease this instinct to protect our child by, modifying that parent behavior. The emotional discipline trap, which, as I said, psych control, it's got a long, long history, just like negative reinforcement, has a long, long history in the learning theory literature. Psychological control has a long, long history in the child development literature. And again, motivated by parents who want to assist and want to improve. But so that's what they want to do. But what they do instead is because they get so, it's hard. If you got a child, if you have a child with anxiety and they're like constantly, kind of like, for lack of a better word, bugging you and nudging you and just saying, Mommy, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go to that. I don't want to say hello to, Grandma. I'm just going to stay in my room, and so the parents, you feel, you don't know what to do. So you say, Rachel, you're embarrassing me. Go say hello to Umbrella. Go say hello to, they call me Wenma. Go say hello to Wenma. Or they go, I'm not sleeping, going to school today. I'm not even going to pack up my bag. You're going. I'm just going to pack your stuff up myself. Again, this is what we do when we're feeling frustrated and we become this, and we show these kinds of dismissiveness kind of things. So again, in the spirit of saying, we know you're motivated by love and wanting to help your child, how can I get, and so you might make a list, and we would make a list, ways I get too much involved with my child, ways to let my child do it on their own. So remind so you might have the parent who's always reminding their child, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do your homework? Did you do that? Don't remind them, so don't remind them to brush their teeth and do the shower, let go. Tell my child what to wear. Let them wear, as long as it's in the school code. So whatever, if they want to wear the plaids and the stripes, whatever. This is the type of thing about trying to decrease this use of psychological control. Now, again, it's one thing to say this clinically, but it's another thing when you actually have data to show this. And, when I was at FIU, we did a trial, and it was and it was for a single site. It was a huge trial. And the reason why things are in green is because what is really important is that we actually, I'm a believer of less is more. And so what we did is that we had CBT for people were randomized to either CBT alone, or children and parents who were randomized to one arm, which is CBT plus parents, where they were trained in what I just showed you with decreasing negative reinforcement. We also worked on being positive and increasing positive reinforcement. And then we did the other arm, which was a CBT plus parent relationship. And there we worked on increasing acceptance, get to be more positive, be more supportive. And we focused on decreasing psych control. Now, what, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm assuming you can. What's important whenever you want to, and whenever you want to show you have a mechanism, it's important to show that this treatment is significantly improving this, and that this is associated with that. So you got to have like this thing here, here, and here. Okay, it's not enough, because we actually did find that we increased this and we increased that, but it didn't impact anxiety outcome. So long story short, that's why we have these greens. It's almost like more important. And it's like, well, I'm going to do, but it's actually it's almost like it's more important for parents not to do the negative, or quote, unhelpful stuff. It's not, and not to say doing the good stuff doesn't matter, but really doing that bad, inappropriate stuff probably has even more of an impact in terms of targeting. So it doesn't mean you should just target the bad stuff, but in terms of, but it's really important to focus on both of these things, and particularly on these two components. And I know Dan said he didn't want to put up an outcome, I hope you forgive me. And by the way, these are very, very simplified versions of our outcome. If our papers are very complicated with a lot of fancy schmancy statistical modeling, but the only thing I want to say is that this is a happy face, because it is, as far as I know, like the only study that was with with this kind of power, with this type of streamlining parent components. And we did find, and with the child ratings and the parent ratings and with other variables, but these are the ones I'm putting up for simplicity, that both of these parent arms were significantly enhancing treatment over the individual. And more importantly, we measured those components. And what you can see is when we had a measure that looked at parents' ratings of their use of the protection trap, and we had another, or negative reinforcement, we had another measure of site control, and we did find it declined when we targeted it. And it did not decline in the condition, the individual CBT. That's very important, because a lot of times people throw a lot of things in treatments, and you know what? Even when you don't target it, things change. This showed a very specific targeting, and that this targeting led to this. And we're very happy about that. And I'm going to tell you where we're taking this. But before I go further, I do want to say something else, especially in this era of COVID. And I just kind of because it's hard. It's hard. It's tough. And especially, I told you, the low SES, the parents of children with special needs, the lack of accessibility for so many people to get care. So I kind of just said, oh, we got to teach the parents this. We got to teach them. I say it, but I'm well aware, believe me, that it's so much easier said than done. And, parents, especially with the employment, they got double jobs, they got, and the single parents households that, I showed you did worse. I'm sorry if I missed that point. So it is really important, before anybody can do anything for their kid, for their child. It's like what they say in the airlines, put that mask on, whether it be a COVID mask, put that mask on for yourself. And so check in with yourself first. And take I think somebody needs to get on mute. And take a break, ask for help. It's okay to say you're not okay, and seek the mental health support. And I've just got a couple of more slides, and then I will wrap up. And related to what I just said about the need for what I just said about the parent self-care. Well, remember that study where I showed you the predictors of children's positive affect? Well, in that same study, I meant the study that showed the predictors of children's anxiety. That same study actually looked at predictors of children's positive affect, and it maps onto what I just said about parent self-care. So parents who were able to talk about the plans, to keep the routines, to participate in family activities, those were the top two predictors of positive affect. And related to self-care, outdoor exercise, that was a third predictor. And then and then having a pre-existing internalizing problems, as I said, if you're a child with anxiety problems or depression, you don't do as well. And so it was a negative predictor of positive affect. So the point is, positive affect, parents, self-care, routines, activities, seems to be an important predictor. And again, maybe we hear it in the media, but I like science to back us up. So now I just want to close with what we're doing next for a moment, because I really do believe, based on these many decades of studying this, that if we want to, that these are two key components. And Leon, I'm so glad that you did, if you're on, I want to thank you for your fabulous presentation, because we're doing exactly what you're doing, but we're way, way, way behind you. But we are developing an app because I do think we need, for all the reasons you said, I also feel we need to get stronger effects sizes, and we need to get stronger, better sustainability. So we're working on this. And we're working on this, but I'm going to show you just a few seconds of this, but I also want to say, and all of these presentations today are really weaving together nicely. The data I showed you were based on FIU. They were based on largely Hispanic families. So we are working in the ways that Leanne spoke about, but and also the way Dan spoke about, we're tailoring this. I don't know if what we found is going to fit for all the different, groups that exist in America or in other parts of the world. So we are developing, at this point, we're beginning an app for parents, Latinas, and we're focusing on these two variables. So this is Marcel, who apparently has a huge following on TikTok among Hispanics about a parenting a TikTok thing. And then the other person you'll see who plays the therapist was one of my former graduate students and postdoc, and she's actually working with me now. We're working together at Yale, and she's the other one, Carla Marin.
Le da miedo ir a la escuela, yo lo veo tan angustiado que le digo que sí se puede quedar en la casa. ¿Qué pasó el otro día? ¿Yo que se le ayudó a ir a la escuela? A ver, pues al otro día vuelve y me dice que no quiere ir a la escuela, entonces pues yo ya no sé qué hacer para ayudarle a quitar ese miedo. Bueno, usted me acaba de decir que entre más le permite que no vaya a la escuela, él más insiste en no ir. Por lo tanto, es claro que entre más evite eso que le causa ansiedad, más ansiedad le va a dar. De hecho, esto de ayudarle a los hijos a evitar a ese pobrecito Carlitos que le...
Okay, I'm going to stop because I'm running, but I just wanted to get a sense. This is way, way, way in the early stages, but I'm super excited about it. So my summary is anxiety is higher than ever. CBT is the strongest evidence-based approach. I think that, if of all the things we can do with parents, of all the things in our toolbox, I think the data are beginning to move more and more towards the protection trap and reducing emotional discipline, trying to become more streamlined and more efficient and using the mechanisms that work, that have been shown to be related. Parent self-care is important, and our digital intervention for Latino parents is under development. And I just want to give a shout out to the great team at Yale. And I want to give a shout out. I can't list all the students. I know I have a student listening there, Jessica, and thank you, Jessica, who was involved at FIU. And again, so my colleagues at Yale, my former dear friend Bill, and now my friend Jeremy at FIU. And then I just also want to do a little, just for those of you in Miami, just go to the FIU website, because Jeremy and I now have a large clinical trial where we're doing other ways to enhance CBT. So just look at that. And there's compensation. And there's also compensation for doing just an assessment study, even if you don't have anxiety. So I encourage you to go to the FIU anxiety program website if you're interested in participating in these clinical trials and or assessment studies for compensation and to get help. And with that, I'm going to thank you very, very much.
Oh, great.
Great. Thank you very much, Wendy. Before we jump into this, let me remind everybody to fill the audio evaluation form at the end of the training today. Don't leave home without it. Do it so that you can get proper credit for your participation here today. Thank you, Wendy. It's great. It's great. Are you there, Don? Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm here, and I managed to keep people on more or less. I tried my best, but what can I say? It's 4:30 in the afternoon, so I did my best.
You did great.
It was great.
Yeah. Wendy?
Yes. Thank you.
The trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, they have a whole training program online with Esther Deblinger having all this data that involving the parent was really critical. And they have a whole model on when and how they engage the parent in the sequence. I was wondering if you had any, looking at that particular protocol and whether it would have particular relevance in your topic.
I mean, first of all, Don, you know, since I mean, because we know each other. So just to say, you know, my very, very first job as an visiting assistant was at Stony Brook for 1 year, and I was on Esther's dissertation with Alan Ross as the chair.
Oh,
so I know Esther for a long, long time.
Okay.
We're friends. So, but you know, I think I don't think though. I mean, I love Esther; she's fabulous. But I don't think they've done, you know, these kinds of, you know, comparative trials, and so I think I'm sure it's helpful, but I guess, you know, what's that?
They have a protocol where they see the parents and the kids separately in terms of the abuse.
Yeah, no, I get, yeah.
And they bring up, that whole model. I didn't know.
Yeah, I know, but I don't think they've done the comparatives, you know, like that I just talked about.
Research on it, but I was just kind of curious as to whether that format works.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, I think parents play a role. I think it's like what you were saying at the very first thing this morning, Don, like, well, what is most important? You know, there's so many things we could be training people. And so I think that's the key.
Yeah, I love your lovely presentation. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Lopez, do you have a question or comment?
No, I would just want to thank you guys for this great presentations. All of them were great. And this last one, like all of them, it was great. Dr. Silverman, it was very good. All of them were great. And I thank you. And this should be promoted more, especially here in Dade County. We have the 4th largest public school system in the nation. I am retired. I've retired 6 years ago, but I worked in the school system for 40 years as a school psychologist. And let me tell you, everything that you guys said, it's real. It's really real. And I want to thank you all. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. You want to say something, Wendy?
No, I would only end the way I began, and with my heartfelt comment. And I'm so happy to see Lynn there, and see Dawn there, and see you, Etione, and I really.
Right.
Listen, and you have
Nice.
You have an invitation from Chicago to try the app over there. From,
oh yeah, Leanne. Leanne, I need to learn from you. You know, we're just.
No, this is from Colleen in Chicago. Colleen Cicchetti.
Yeah, we'd love to. Both of your apps. We're needing to go big in Chicago right now. And we need
love to do that with you, Colleen. And can I just say something, Wendy? One of the questions I had is around comorbidity. We did a study, and we have to publish this. I'm gonna poke my researcher, Jeb. We need to poke them when we get back. We did a study a while ago where we looked at comorbidity in regards to conduct and anxiety, because a lot of our kids, as you saw when I presented, have anxiety, right? They're externalizers. High externalizers. So we found in the study that we did that SNAP was appropriate if the kids had higher conduct, lower anxiety, do SNAP. If they were equal, you can do it. But if they were higher on anxiety and lower on conduct, we needed to deal with the anxiety first. And then, so it's a beautiful study, and I need to get Adam to finish publishing it, or we'll get Dr. ready to do it or something. But do you see those differences in the kids that you see if they have those comorbidity?
So, how much time do we have? Because I know.
You got time.
What's that?
You got time.
Okay, so I guess, so I actually have been collaborating because I'm actually, really good friends with these NIMH intramural researchers. And so I don't know if you know, so like besides Danny Pine, also Ellen Liebenloft and Melissa Brotman, because they, especially Danny's an anxiety researcher, but Ellen and Melissa are leaders in irritability. Ellen basically invented the whole field of irritability, and we've been working with them because when you say conduct, maybe it's conduct, but I think irritability is a transdiagnostic. It's almost like fever that goes across all conditions. Irritability goes across transdiagnostic categories, and it particularly is strongest with anxiety and depression.
I'd love to send you, yeah.
Ellen became famous because everybody used to think childhood irritability was an early indicator of bipolar. It's not. It's not. If anything, it's most predictive of anxiety and depression. And we have found that the irritable kids, and we have an irritability scale that Melissa developed. Oh, no, it is the Melissa Institute, by the way. So, but anyway, her name is Melissa Votman, and we have an irritability scale. And yes, indeed, the irritability kids don't do as well with the CBT. And so we're working, and so we've got like an intervention. We have
Oh
an
my
exposure.
God. I'm going to have to send, sorry, I'm
This
gonna
has
have to,
exposure-based irritability, exposure to irritability. So I don't know about conduct, but
I'll have to send you a paper because that's exactly what Dr. Jeff Burke found. So when they did the randomized control style, the large one on SNAP in Pittsburgh, he said, there was a subgroup of kids that were just different. They were more irritable, like they were irritable. And so when he started to tease apart looked at the mechanisms of change after, and then he started to look at that, he found that there was a subgroup of irritable kids. And you're right, they didn't do as well if you look at it, but when he took the SNAP model and he adapted it for those irritable kids, he started to get some interesting findings. So I have a paper, I can send that to you from Jeff.
Sure.
On that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we're coming to the very end. Elise, you can unmute now if you want for a moment. I want everybody to help me give a send-off to Elise, who is going to be here in this role with us at this conference for the last time now, at least for the time being. And we have really, really loved having you and helping us make this conference the great conference that it has become over the past several years. So thank you very much, Elise. And
I'm not letting her go.
We'll try to hire her to do it again next year. We'll see.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here and be part of the Melissa Institute for not as many as some of you, but for some, I think about 5 years now. I've been at the Melissa Institute, 5 or 6 years.
We know where you live.
Yes, you do.
And so just in closing, Don, is there anything you want to say to the group before we?
I started off this morning by saying thank you for your attendance and interest, and moreover, commend you for your good judgment of being here. And absolutely, this was a most rewarding day, and I hope to see you all next year. And I want to thank all those who have reached out in my moment of grief and who will support the Melissa Institute. So thank you all.
Thank you all. We'll be preparing all the materials for dissemination through the YouTube channel. So they'll be out there. We'll let you know. And there'll be other communications coming out following the conference about reminders about the credits and little things like that that make our life fun. So, all right. Thank you.